The sky over Dry Creek turned the color of old bruises, just as she said the words that would come back to haunt her. She stood on the porch of the run-down boarding house, with her arms folded tight against the wind, and told the whole town she did not want a cowboy in her life, not one with dust on his boots or lies in his smile. The men gathered by the hitching post shifted their hats and looked at one another, and Caleb Turner, leaning easy against the rail with his thumbs hooked in his belt, felt the sting of it like a spur to the ribs. The wind carried her voice sharp and clear across the street, and the first roll of thunder answered her like the sky itself had something to say about it. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had come west with a trunk full of books and a heart full of plans that did not include any man who measured his worth by cattle brands and quick draws. She wanted a schoolhouse with glass windows, a garden with white fencing, and peace that did not depend on who could ride fastest or shoot straightest. She had seen what cowboys left behind in towns like this, broken promises and empty whiskey bottles, and she swore to herself she would build something different in Dry Creek, something steady and respectable, something that did not wear spurs to supper. Caleb Turner had not meant to ride into her life. He had only come to town for supplies and a telegram he never sent. But when he saw her stepping down from the stagecoach 3 weeks ago, with her chin high and her skirts gathered against the dust, something in him shifted like a horse catching scent of rain. He was not like the others, or at least that is what he told himself. He worked a small spread north of town, kept to himself, and minded his cattle better than most men minded their manners. Still, he wore the same hat and the same sunburned look that made Clara turn her eyes away. The storm did not ask who wanted what. It came roaring over the plains with a wall of black clouds and wind that bent the cottonwoods near double. Barrels rolled down the street, and a sign tore loose from the saloon and went skidding across the mud. Clara had been out by the well trying to gather her laundry when the first hard rain slapped against her face. The sky cracked open with lightning that split the air like a rifle shot, and in her hurry she slipped on the wet boards, falling hard against the trough as the wind howled wild as a pack of wolves. Caleb saw her fall from across the street, and in that instant nothing else mattered, not her sharp words, not the laughter from the porch of the Mercantile. He crossed the distance in long strides just as a loose shutter came flying down from the boarding house roof. He caught it one-handed before it could strike her. The impact jolted his arm to the shoulder, but he did not let go. Rain soaked through his shirt and plastered his hat to his head as he crouched beside her, telling her to get up and move, his voice low but steady against the roar of the storm. Clara tried to protest, pride burning hotter than the sting in her ankle. But another crack of thunder made the ground tremble, and she saw then that this was no ordinary squall. The sky was spinning low and strange, the wind shifting directions like it had lost its senses. Caleb did not wait for permission. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain, her hands gripping his shoulders in spite of herself, and carried her toward the livery stable, the only building in town with walls thick enough to stand against a twister if one decided to drop down from that wicked sky. Inside the stable, the air was thick with the smell of hay and frightened horses. The animals stamped and whinnied as the wind battered the doors. Caleb set her down on a pile of blankets near the back stall and braced the main doors with a heavy beam, each gust slamming against the wood like a giant testing its strength. Clara watched him through the dim light, his movements sure and He spoke to the horses in a calm murmur that seemed to steady them, and when the building shook so hard, dust rained from the rafters, he stepped in front of her without thinking, as if his body alone could hold back the storm for a long moment that felt like the space between heartbeats. The world outside screamed and twisted. Rain drove sideways through the cracks, and lightning flashed blue against the gaps in the boards. Clara pressed her hand to her ankle and realized the pain had dulled beneath a deeper awareness. She was not alone in this fury, not abandoned to the wild temper of the plains. Caleb stood there solid as a fence post, set deep in the earth. Hat gone now, hair plastered to his brow, eyes fixed on the doors, and when the worst of the wind finally passed and the thunder rolled farther east, she looked at the cowboy she claimed she did not want, and understood, for the first time, that sometimes the very thing you swear against is the only thing standing between you and ruin. When the storm finally rolled east and left Dry Creek gasping beneath a torn and silvered dawn, the town did not look like the same place that had heard Clara Whitmore's bold declaration the evening before. Fences lay flattened like matchsticks, the Mercantile had lost half its roof, and muddy water ran in crooked streams down the main street. Clara stepped carefully from the livery stable with Caleb's arm steady at her waist, her ankle wrapped tight in a strip torn from his own shirt. She hated the weakness of leaning on him, yet she could not deny the warmth of his hand, nor the way his presence seemed to quiet the trembling still lingering in her bones. Men moved through the wreckage with grim faces, righting barrels and dragging broken boards from the road. Women gathered children close and counted blessings in low voices. Clara watched as Caleb said little and did much. He lifted beams with the blacksmith, secured a frightened mare for old Mrs. Harper, and checked the well for damage without once seeking thanks or attention. This was not the reckless sort of cowboy she had sworn against. He carried himself like a man who understood the weight of land and livestock and neighbors alike, and that unsettled her more than any smooth-talking drifter ever could. By midday the sun burned, bright and merciless, over the wreckage. Clara insisted she could manage on her own, but when she tried to put weight on her ankle it buckled beneath her, and pride gave way to pain. Caleb did not tease or scold. He simply crouched in front of her and told her to climb on, his voice as steady as it had been in the storm. She hesitated only a breath before sliding onto his back, the town watching with open curiosity, and as he carried her to the boarding house steps, she felt the solid strength beneath her palms and wondered how she had mistaken strength for danger inside the boarding house. The windows rattled in their frames, and the hallway smelled of damp wood. Caleb set her down gently in a chair near the hearth and knelt to examine the swelling at her ankle. His hands were rough, scarred from rope burns and years of ranch work, yet his touch was careful as a doctor's. He told her it was only a bad twist, that she would be walking in a few days if she kept off it. She studied the crease between his brows as he focused, and for the first time she noticed the quiet patience in him, the kind that grows from long seasons of drought and hard winters survived without complaint. The days that followed brought more work than Dry Creek had seen in years, and though Clara could not join in the heavy labor, she found ways to help, organizing meals for the men, repairing roofs and mending fences, writing letters for those who had lost family photographs and precious keepsakes. Each afternoon Caleb stopped by with updates from the northern pastures. He spoke of cattle scattered by the storm and a section of fence torn clean away, never boasting, never dramatizing, just stating facts like a man accustomed to solving problems one at a time. One evening, as the sky turned soft gold over the plains, Clara sat on the porch with her ankle propped on a stool. Caleb leaned against the railing below, hat in his hands. He told her about the first storm he had ridden through alone as a boy, how his father had trusted him with a herd twice his size, and how fear had clawed at his chest until he learned to breathe through it. Clara listened, surprised by the honesty in his words. There was no swagger in the telling, only memory and a hint of old ache, and she realized that the West carved its men with the same hard tools it used on the land. Clara confessed then, almost against her will, that her father had been a gambler who drifted from town to town, charming and reckless, leaving debts and broken promises behind. It was not cowboys she feared, she admitted, but the kind of man who could not stay. Caleb did not interrupt. He let the silence stretch easy between them before he said he had buried both his parents on his ranch hill, and had no intention of leaving that ground unless it was feet first. The words were plain, yet they settled into her heart. Like stakes driven deep, the town began to talk, as towns will, about the schoolteacher and the rancher who had weathered the storm together. Clara heard the whispers and felt her cheeks warm, but she no longer felt the sharp need to correct them. Instead, she watched Caleb from her porch as he rode past at dusk, his silhouette strong against the fading light, and she understood that what she had rejected in pride might be the very steadiness she had prayed for in secret. Still, she held her guard close, because changing one's mind is a harder thing than surviving any storm, and Clara Whitmore was not yet ready to admit that the cowboy she claimed she did not want was quietly becoming the man. She could not stop thinking about storms do not always come from the sky. Some ride in on horseback with hard eyes and harder intentions, and 2 weeks after the clouds cleared over Dry Creek, trouble arrived in the shape of Victor Hale, a cattle broker with a silver watch chain and a smile too sharp to trust. He rode into town with 3 hired men at his back and a claim that half the northern pasture, including a stretch of land Caleb's family had worked for 20 years, rightfully belonged to him. Clara saw the way Caleb's shoulders tightened when the papers were unfolded on the saloon table, saw the quiet fire settle behind his eyes, and she felt the old fear stir inside her. fear of men who took what they wanted and left others to sweep up the dust. Hell spoke smooth and loud for all to hear, declaring that Caleb's father had defaulted on a loan years ago, that the land had been signed over in settlement, that he had only now come to collect what was his. Some in town shifted uneasily, others muttered that they had never heard such talk before. Caleb did not raise his voice. He only said his father died debt-free, and that any claim against the Turner Ranch was a lie. The air inside the saloon grew tight as a drawn wire, and Clara understood that this fight would not be settled by words alone. That night Clara could not sleep. She turned Hale's claims over in her mind like pages in a book that refused to make sense. Then she remembered the old wooden chest in the boarding house attic, the one left behind by the former owner, who had once served as Dry Creek's notary. With her ankle now healed enough to bear her weight, she climbed the narrow steps with a lantern in hand, dust swirling in the light, and began searching through stacks of brittle papers tied with faded ribbon, her heart thudding as thunder had once thudded in the sky. Near dawn she found it, a ledger noting the final payment on a loan made to Caleb's father, signed and stamped with the town seal, the date clear as day, and the amount marked paid in full. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She realized Hale's papers must have been forged or altered, and without hesitation she wrapped the ledger in cloth and hurried out into the paling morning. The prairie air cooled against her cheeks as she made her way toward the Turner Ranch, knowing that sometimes salvation does not come from strength alone, but from knowing where to look. Caleb was in the north pasture repairing fence when she found him, the sun just breaking over the horizon and painting the land in gold. He looked up at the sound of her horse, and surprise flickered across his face when he saw her riding alone. Clara dismounted with less grace than usual but more determination. She handed him the ledger without ceremony, telling him what she had discovered, and as he read the entry his jaw tightened, not with anger this time, but with fierce relief. They rode back to town together, side by side, dust rising behind them like a banner. Hale was waiting near the saloon, confident as ever, but confidence faltered when Clara stepped forward and presented the ledger before the gathered townsfolk. She spoke clear and steady, explaining the record, the seal, the date, the proof that the Turner Ranch stood free of debt. Murmurs swelled into open accusation against Hal, and under the weight of evidence his polished smile cracked. By noon he and his men were riding out of Dry Creek, with nothing but dust at their backs. When the crowd dispersed and the street settled into its usual rhythm, Caleb turned to Clara with a look she had never seen before, something open and unguarded. He told her she had saved more than his land. She had saved his father's name and the memory tied to it. Clara felt her heart pound, not with fear, but with certainty. She had once said she did not want a cowboy, had spoken the words like a shield against disappointment, but standing there beneath the wide western sky, she understood that it was never the hat or the boots she feared. It was the risk of trusting someone strong enough to matter. The wind moved gentle through Dry Creek that evening, nothing like the wild fury that had first driven them together. Caleb stood with his hat in his hands, not as a swaggering rancher, but as a man asking plain and honest whether she might consider building her schoolhouse on a corner of his land, where the cottonwoods offered shade and the creek ran steady even in dry months. Clara looked at him, at the man who had carried her through a storm and stood firm against a lie, and she smiled slow and sure, telling him she never wanted just any cowboy, only the one who stayed when the sky turned dark. And under a sky now calm and endless, she chose him, not because he saved her from the storm, but because he proved he would stand beside her long after it passed.